Okay, so welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
We always try to pick some really cool stuff, and this one, this is a good one, I think.
Yeah, I think we're going to deep on this one. I think we're going really deep.
Yeah, we are, and it's timely too. This
Yeah.
is, the type of stuff we love to look at, especially with, everything going on in the world today, right?
Absolutely.
So this is, like I said, it's going to be a deep dive, and we're looking at a slice of Cold War history through like some declassified
Oh,
documents.
very cool.
Yeah, we have two CIA documents, and they're both dated March 18, 2025.
Okay.
But get this, the content is actually drawn from intelligence reports from 1991.
Wow.
Yeah, so think about that. Like we're peeling back layers of time to understand a specific moment, and this is a kind of a crazy moment in history, 1991.
Absolutely. A lot going on. Then the world is changing rapidly.
Exactly. So our focus for today is Nikolai Ivanovich Nikonov, and he was a former Soviet diplomat. And our mission for you today, listening to this, is to understand who this man was, what made U.S. intelligence take notice, and why these details from his background might still be relevant today.
Sounds fascinating.
It is. So let's unpack all of this, starting with the first document, right, which goes into the initial contact between a U.S. professor, and they give him the code name Sliva.
Okay.
And Sliva is our guy in Moscow.
Got it.
And he's talking to Nikonov, and they call him Seva.
Save it. Okay.
So Seva is meeting with Seva in Moscow between September and November 1991.
All right.
Now, this Nikonov wasn't just some academic. He was a long-standing KGB official, a lieutenant colonel, who is described as cut off from active service at this point.
Cut off, huh?
Yeah.
That's interesting right off the bat. Makes you wonder why, was it forced retirement, strategic repositioning, or maybe even a sign of like the, internal struggles going on within the KGB as the Soviet Union started to, fall apart.
Right. And that's exactly the type of ambiguity
Yeah.
U.S. intelligence would have been really trying to figure out.
For sure, they'd want to know what was going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the document also tells us that he had been with the KGB since 1974 and that he'd worked in their second chief directorate. And before this whole thing, he was actually teaching at St. Petersburg State University up until September of 91.
Interesting. So kind of bouncing back and forth between academia and the intelligence world.
Yeah, and get this, he actually had a prior connection to the professor from a 1987 academic exchange in Washington, D.C.
Oh, wow. So they already knew each other in some capacity.
Exactly. And it just goes to show you how even these seemingly harmless interactions could become important, in the world of intelligence gathering.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about connections and who knows who in that world. So I imagine that pre-existing link with the professor provided a convenient and kind of, low-key way to make initial contact, something that wouldn't necessarily raise any eyebrows right away.
Exactly. It was like the perfect cover.
It also suggests that Nikonov was comfortable, interacting with Westerners, at least on a professional level, and that could have made him stand out within the KGB.
Interesting point. So now we get to the professor's assessment of Nikonov.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting because it's a little bit nuanced.
Okay. How so?
Well, he's described as intelligent, articulate, and well-read, which, points to a pretty sharp mind.
Yeah, definitely sounds like someone who's got it together.
Right.
Oh.
But then the professor goes on to label him as extremely intelligent and hardline.
Okay, so there's another layer there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And here's the kicker. The professor believed Nikonov would likely follow KGB directives if he was ever reactivated for a, quote, truly sponsored visit to the U.S.
So even though he was technically cut off, they were still worried about him potentially being an active agent.
Exactly. That possibility was a big concern for them.
I can see why that would make them nervous. It really shows you the careful and sometimes, suspicious nature of intelligence work. Even if someone seems to be out of the game, you can't just ignore their past or their beliefs. And that hardline label probably came from what they discussed, right?
Yeah.
Suggesting that he held some pretty strong beliefs that maybe aligned with what the KGB wanted.
You got it. And those discussions seem to have been a turning point because the report mentions that the professor ended their contact on November 10th, 1991.
Why was that?
Well, because Nikonov's views during their last meeting just kind of confirmed everything the professor was already thinking.
Interesting.
And on top of that, Nikonov had said he was interested in a personal trip to the U.S. around the same time the professor was heading back to Maryland.
Oh, so the timing was a little too coincidental.
Yeah, that definitely raised some red flags for the professor.
Of course, a personal trip at the same time as the professor's return, especially from someone like Nikonov, it would make anyone suspicious. Was it really just a personal trip, or was it a way to keep in touch, maybe in a less official way, or even to make some new connections for other purposes?
Those are all really good questions, and the professor obviously thought the same thing because that's when he decided to cut off contact.
Makes sense.
Now let's move on to Nikhanov's background.
Okay.
We find out that his grandfather was a prominent Soviet jurist.
Hmm. So he came from a family with some serious connections in the Soviet system.
Exactly. And that kind of background could definitely have opened doors for him and maybe even provided him with some protection within the Soviet hierarchy.
Yeah, it shows he wasn't just some random guy. He had a certain level of influence.
Right. And then we get into his KGB work history, which is pretty revealing.
What does it say?
Well, it says that his main focus was the U.S. He meticulously studied American affairs, culture, lifestyles, you name it. He was considered an expert.
Wow, so he really knew his stuff when it came to America.
Oh, yeah. And someone with that kind of specialized knowledge would have been a huge asset to the KGB.
Absolutely. Knowing your enemy is crucial in the intelligence world. And Nikhanov's deep understanding of American society would have been invaluable for analysis, predicting what might happen and even planning operations.
Exactly. But here's where things get really interesting. The report mentions a 1981 coup attempt at the American embassy in Moscow.
A coup. What happened?
Apparently, Nikhanov, even though he was off duty, he reported to his KGB post.
Okay.
But his boss dismissed him for both. And get this, they use these abbreviations INF and NF reasons.
INF and NF. I wonder what those stand for.
We don't know for sure, but what kind of internal rules or reasons would the KGB have for classifying something like that?
That's a good question. It's hard to say for certain without seeing the original KGB files, but I would guess that INF probably refers to some kind of violation of their internal regulations or procedures. Maybe something to do with showing up for duty when he wasn't supposed to.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then NF is a little trickier, but it could be something about his judgment or his reliability in that specific situation. The fact that he was dismissed, even though he seemed to be against the coup, well, it suggests that the KGB was very strict about following protocol, or maybe there were some internal power struggles going on.
Yeah, it's a real mystery.
It is, but the story takes another turn because after about a year, Nikhanov was reinstated.
Really?
Yep. And not only that, he was promoted to a higher KGB rank and given a civilian position that was equivalent to his old rank.
Wow, talk about a comeback.
I know, right? And get this, his friends reportedly thought he was delighted about it.
That's quite a turnaround from being dismissed.
It really is. I mean, his quick reinstatement and promotion, even after that whole incident at the embassy, it tells me that the KGB really needed his expertise on America. It shows just how important that kind of knowledge was, even when there were these internal power shifts, and his friends thinking he was delighted. Well, that could be genuine, or it could just be, the expected reaction to getting back in good graces with the system.
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure.
Absolutely.
Now, this next detail is really interesting. The report says that after Bakitin became the chairman of the KGB, Nikhanov's very first assignment was to make arrangements for the KGB-CIA liaison relationship.
Wow, that's a pretty sensitive and politically charged task, especially for a first assignment.
You get it. I mean, setting up a direct line of communication between two intelligence agencies that were basically enemies, it takes a lot of trust and political skill.
No kidding. The fact that they gave this job to Nikhanov so early in Bakitin's time as chairman, well, it suggests they saw him as someone who could handle these complex situations, or at least someone whose specific skills were absolutely necessary for this crucial initiative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now let's move on to the second document.
Okay.
And this one focuses on a review of Nikhanov's KGB files.
Interesting. What did they find?
Well, overall, it's pretty positive. They described him as politically mature, professionally prepared, and possessing initiative.
So it sounds like their assessment lines up with what the professor thought. Intelligent articulates someone who takes charge.
Right. And the files even mentioned that he had been considered for leadership roles within the KGB's American department.
That makes sense given his experience.
Exactly. It just shows how much they valued him within the organization.
But weren't there some negative things in the files, too?
You're right. There was one kind of interesting anecdote that they included. Apparently, back in 1986, there was a target firing training exercise.
Okay.
And Nikhanov was watching his buddies fire, and they weren't doing so well.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. And then when it was his turn, he also performed poorly. The file suggested that this incident might have hurt his career, and they even labeled him a poor shot.
That's kind of funny in a way. You have this image of these serious KGB agents, and then there's this little detail about one of them not being very good at shooting.
I know, it's kind of humanizing, isn't it?
It is. It shows that even in the super high-stakes world of espionage, people are still people, and they have their weaknesses. And, it also suggests that even within a highly structured organization like the KGB personal performance, even in something that seems minor, could be noticed and potentially affect someone's career. It's hard to say for sure if this shooting incident really held him back, but the fact that it's in his files shows just how closely they were watching everyone.
Absolutely, every detail mattered. So the second document also sheds some light on Nikhanov's involvement in a pretty big historical mystery,
Oh, really? What's that?
the disappearance of Raoul Wallenberg.
The Swedish diplomat who vanished in Soviet custody back in 1945.
That's the one. Apparently, Nikhanov was tasked by Bakitin to investigate what happened to Wallenberg.
Wow, given all the international pressure surrounding that case, that must have been a really sensitive assignment.
For sure. I mean, the world, especially Sweden, never stopped pushing the Soviets for answers about what happened to Wallenberg.
Right, so putting Nikonov, someone with his analytical skills and access to the KGB archives on this case, shows how important it was to Bakitin to try and finally address this issue.
Exactly. So
Right.
what did Nikhanov find?
Well, after looking through all sorts of KGB archives, he couldn't find any solid evidence that Wallenberg lived past July 17th, 1947.
That's the official date of death, right?
Yeah, but here's the thing. He did find evidence from several sources that suggested Wallenberg was actually alive after that date.
So that contradicts the official Soviet story.
It does, and that's a big deal. This discovery would have challenged everything they had been saying for years. It implies that while the official records might tell one story, there was other evidence within the KGB's own files that pointed to a different truth. It raises serious questions about possible cover-ups or inconsistencies in their reporting.
Wow, so they were basically hiding the truth.
It seems that way, and there's another layer to this whole thing. Nikhanov's report mentioned diplomatic identity documents and arguments that were used to give fake diplomatic cover to people who were involved in Nazi war crimes.
Wow, are you serious?
Yeah, and these people were allowed to escape. The report says there's no proof of what happened to Wallenberg beyond these discrepancies. So it's like while they were looking for information about Wallenberg, they stumbled upon all these other dark secrets from after the war.
That's crazy. It just shows how complicated and morally ambiguous things were during and after World War II.
It does. And the fact that it involved people who were involved in Nazi war crimes just highlights how tangled everything was back then. There were alliances, betrayals, hidden agendas. It's a really complex web.
So now let's fast forward to the end of 1991, and we see that Nikhanov is listed as a professor of history at the University of Maryland, Moscow.
So he's back in academia.
Yep, and he's scheduled to go to Annapolis, Maryland for the winter 1991 term as a Fulbright scholar.
Interesting.
And his proposed research topic was current U.S.-USSR relations.
Wow, talk about being in the right place at the right time. The Soviet Union was going through some massive changes at that point. The timing of this is just remarkable.
It really is. For a former high-ranking KGB official with all this knowledge about the U.S. to suddenly move into academia and focus on the rapidly changing relationship between the two superpowers, and then to get a Fulbright scholarship to go to the U.S., it's pretty strange.
It definitely raises some eyebrows.
And don't forget, he had already been to the U.S. twice before on academic exchange programs.
So this wasn't his first rodeo?
Not at all. And during this Fulbright, he was expected to meet with U.S. government officials, academics, all sorts of people.
And I'm sure U.S. intelligence was keeping a close eye on all of this.
Oh, absolutely. The report specifically says that this information was shared with the relevant U.S. government agencies for assessment. They were definitely taking his arrival seriously.
Of course. I mean, from their perspective, someone with Nikhanov's background experience and recent activities would warrant some serious scrutiny. Even if his Fulbright was totally legitimate for academic purposes, you can't rule out the possibility of other motives, whether for himself or someone else.
So let's wrap this up for our listeners. We have Nikolai Nikhanov, a former KGB lieutenant colonel, a true expert on the United States, who was cut off, but still potentially hardlined. He came from a family connected to the Soviet establishment. He was involved in the KGB-CIA liaison. He investigated the disappearance of Raoul Wallenberg, and then right as the Soviet Union was collapsing, he was going to the U.S. on a Fulbright to study U.S.-USSR relations.
It's a pretty wild story when you put it all together.
It is. He was a man at a really interesting point in history.
Absolutely. All these different parts of his life, his intelligence background, his involvement in high-level diplomatic and investigative matters, and then the sudden shift to academia. It's fascinating and maybe even intentionally ambiguous. It makes you wonder what his real goals were during this time of huge global change.
Right. So here's a final thought for everyone listening. Given all the craziness happening in the Soviet Union at that time, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and considering Nikhonov's unique and multifaceted background, what do you think the real story was behind his move into academia and his plans during his stay in the United States? What does this glimpse into the life of Nikolai Nikonov, as seen through these declassified CIA documents, tell you about the blurry lines between diplomacy, academia, and espionage in those final years of the Cold War?
It's a great question. It makes you think about the hidden complexities of a world in transition and the human stories that play out in the shadows.
Exactly, and that's what we love to do here on the Deep Dive. Peel back those layers and see what we can find.
Absolutely. Until next time.
See you then.